Okay, hello everyone. So we're back for the third installment of my presentation on the Timaeus. So now we're going to be talking about an important element of the Timaean account of cosmogony that I've not yet made significant mention of, namely Chora, Chora, or the receptacle, hupodoker in Greek. Um, Now, this entity is also described as the nurse of generation or becoming, the tithene tes geneseos, the nurse of becoming. Now, rather than use my own words to try and explain what this entity is, I'm going to just dive into the point in the text where Timaeus describes this entity. He uses, and just prior to this passage that I've extracted here, he uses an analogy where he speaks of if someone were to melt gold down into liquid form and put the gold into molds of various shapes, the gold would take on whatever shape of the mold which it's poured into, right? The molten gold. Uh, so there's this idea of like an ontological substrate that um, kind of just takes form, the form of whatever is imposed upon it. So let's look at what Timaeus says. It's worth pointing out that I've mentioned in passing that there are three narrative cycles in the Timaeus. So Critias, when he designates what topic Timaeus's speech is to cover, Critias says that is to begin with the generation of the universe and end with the generation of humans. And Timaeus does that three times over, really, in three, let's say, narrative circles, loops. Um, but each time he's not exactly repeating verbatim what he said prior. He's always adding extra details, changing the order, and changing the focus. In a way, you could say the first narrative cycle is focused on astronomy and maths and music and number and order. The second one is very much focused on this entity Cora. And then the third one is focused on the reconciliation of uh, necessity as a kind of irrational cause and reason as the supremely rational cause. And it also has a very strong medical and anatomical focus as well. At any rate, so we're in the middle, the early portion of the middle of the narrative loops, and we encounter this passage describing Cora the receptacle. I'm going to refer to her as she, just because Cora is grammatically feminine. Okay, so she receives all things, but she does not receive a similar shape or form to any of the things that enter her. Um, and she is like a mold uh, in her nature via all things. Um, and she's moved about and shaped by the things that enter her. And her appearance changes this way and that way accordingly. Um, and the things that go in and come out are all imitations, mimemata, always imitations of the onta, right? That is, of the forms, of the stuff of being, right? The ideas of the noetic zoa of the within the paradigm, right? Is the implication. Um, and it's worth pointing out briefly as a side note that I believe, towards the end of the third narrative loop of the Timaeus, when Timaeus briefly discusses sperm and insemination, he describes in terms of the spermata as like mini zdoa being cast as like seeds into like a fertile plot of land. And I can't help but think that there's a bit of an analogism in the way Cora receives forms as imprints to how Timaeus accounts for, let's say, spermatology and insemination. So there's a sense in which I think Cora is like a kind of a cosmic, macrocosmic womb for the demiurge's ideas as causes of creation. And that's not just an arbitrary imposition by me. It's actually, as we're going to see, kind of built into the text quite expressly. So anyway, so the things coming in and going out are always imitations of the onta, right, of the forms, and they are impressed into the mold, right, tupor fenta, right, is and then he says in a manner that is inexplicable and most amazing, which we will later go over in greater detail. It says, but in the present, we need to conceive of three distinct types. First, there is the gignomenon, that is the thing that is begotten, generated. Then there is the thing in which is generated. And then there is the entity from which the generated thing, the gignomenon, arises as an imitation of likeness. Okay, so, and then he specifies what he means. We can liken, and he uses the verb pros eikasai, and that's related to, that's the verb eikasdo, right? Related to eikon, which is critical because we're dealing with an eikos mythos, right? A likely tale, a likely myth, but also an eikastic myth, right? A myth concerned with image making. And indeed, what we have here is a description of how things take shape as images, as likenesses of the ideas of the noetic animals in the paradigm through Korah, who's a mold. And you can see on the left that image is a cast and a mold that have actually survived from antiquity, from the classical period. And that word in Greek, tupos, and the associated verbal forms literally means mold. And we get our word typology from there. And that's going to be a major focus of what we're looking at today, because it has sculptural connotations, right? Because as I've mentioned in the past talk, the whole cosmology is framed as statue building, and Socrates, in his account of the ideal polity in the Republic, presents himself and his interlocutors as virtual statue makers, right? And as we saw, Timaeus and Critias too, in this banquet of logoi, are acting as kind of virtual agalmatopoioi, right? That is statue makers, or antriantopoioi, right? Statue makers. And so I think this discussion of Korah here as a mold, in which forms like impressed, is again connected to that broader theme of the divine macrocosm as a living statue, and hence why there's that womb element that we're going to see, because there's this identification of the artificial, artisanal mold in which a statue takes shape with the womb in which a baby, an organism, takes shape and grows. And those two processes of insemination and gestation in the womb and the molding of molten statues in the mold are kind of subtly identified together right here in the text. So the thing which is the gignomenon, right, that is the begotten thing, the realia, so to speak, of our visible world. Right? The thing in which that takes place is space, Korah, the receptacle, and then the source from whence those forms come, the likenesses of which are imparted through the eikastic image-making process. They, of course, are the forms or the ideas, that is the noetic invisible zdoa within the paradigm, right? The supreme invisible noetic animal that contains all things yet is separate from and ontologically distinct from all things, pure being, right? The mind of God, I would suggest. Now, back to the text. So we are to liken the receptacle to a mother, and the source from whence the ideas are imparted to the father, and the entity between the two should be conceived of as the offspring, the entity between these two natures, i.e. that is the gignomena, right? The things of becoming, the visible parts of our world. and he says, and it should be conceived in no other way, but rather it is as if something is as if the gignomina are imprints in a mold, he says, with various forms. Now, what I want to drive home with all this is that this language of the mold and the imprinting, this typological language, right? Because the word tupos is used along with verbs like plato, meaning to mold. This same kind of diction, this same imagery is used in Book 2 of the Republic, where Socrates first gives his famous criticisms of the traditional mythic poets Homer and Hesiod, and he makes suggestions about, he instead gives his own theological tupoi. He expressly calls them tupoi, right? This word, typoi, right? Molds. He gives the correct molds for proper educational theological poetry that will breed good characters in youths who hear the tales, rather than the culturally established violent and perverted tales of Homer and Hesiod, right? So in these new tales that are going to be told in the ideal republic, he says at Stephanus page 377 BC, he says that they should be molded, the youths should be molded in such a way that the tupos, right, the mold imprint shape, is like imbued into them, into their nature, and in the exact manner which the designer, right, the philosopher king intends. He also says, he kind of, in addition to giving a long list of rules of a theological tupoi, about rules about how the gods and heroes should be depicted, right? So they are to take place within these parameters, these molds of fittingness and palatability, right? In the same way, he also says, he gives this kind of legislative command where he says, first, it would seem, it is necessary to supervise the myth makers, the mythopoioi, so that they always make noble and good myths, which can be judged so, and those which are not so can be like rejected, condemned, and those which are approved, so through this censorship process, we shall convince, we the philosopher kings establishing this polity, we shall convince the nurses and mothers to tell these tales to the children so that they can mold, platane, right, the souls of the youths through these myths, and thus mold their souls just as they do their bodies, right, alluding to the fact that in the archaic pre-modern world, right, mothers and nurses actually molded the physiology of children that were perceived as like malleable, tapestries to be shaped, right? So there's this notion of statue making with the children, but it's not just physical, it's psychological through mythic education. And what I submit is, because Timaeus is giving his account of anthropogony and cosmogony in the context of Socrates' ideal polity being animated as a statue, and that we know in Socrates' ideal polity that citizens were conceived of as being told the noble lie, the myth of metals, that they were metallic statues created directly by God, that they were artisanal products, statues that were alive, rather than being biological products of procreation, of coitus, right? There's that same ambiguity at play there in Socrates' ideal polity's education system with the noble lie, this mythology of being living statues born from the earth, crafted directly by God, right, without coitus, and this kind of strange sexless polity where breeding is very tightly controlled, and people are kind of positioned in such a way to not be totally cognizant of the fact that they are products of coitus, but instead believing this ideology that they are living metal statue men, right? That this subtle diction with verbs like plato, to mold, and words like tupos, mold again as a noun, that none of that is merely coincidental, and there's this huge emphasis on image making and statue production built into the education system, and the way that Plato and his Socrates conceive of mythic education, the psyche, the body-soul compound, right? And basically what we see in the Timaeus is Timaeus, having heard Socrates' extensive discourse on the ideal polity and the education system given to the people therein, who are statue men, okay, he then builds his whole cosmology around this dynamic of statue production and impressing of images into molds and so on. And to support this case further, it's worth noting that in the early portion of the Timaeus, at Stephanus page 19a, in the early portion where Socrates is recapitulating his prior night's lecture on the ideal polity, he actually says the following, that he says that noble characters should be reared, and that the evil characters should be covertly sent off to another city. So what he's saying is that the Phulakes, right, the guardians, the elite military class of the ideal polity, should like have a separate city where they send reprobates, right? And likewise, when even if someone was initially seemed promising like a noble character, but they turn out to be evil, you send them to the reprobate city. And likewise, if someone in the reprobate city shows themselves to be noble, they're taken out of there and brought up to the noble city. And there's this language imbued in the verbs like anagain and epanionton. Like there's this concept of going up. So the idea is that the lower city is underneath and the higher city is above. And I think there is implicit in all this an allusion to Socrates' ideal polity and the concept of the metal men in the Noble Lie, the myth of metals, where you have this idea that the gold and silver philosopher kings and elite military class, the Phulakes, are kind of above ground, and they're managing the citizenry who conceive of themselves as living in this underground subterranean forge where they've been molded directly by God as living statues. And then only when they prove themselves philosophically do they arise to the surface level of governance. And this idea of the language of going up and going down is implying that, you know, certain philosopher kings that are unworthy are taken and bound, so to speak, and returned to the subterranean cavern of the non-illumined demiurgoi, right? Like the low classes that live in the delusional subterranean prison world of believing that they're subterranean metal men, as opposed to the luminous philosophic city above where the governance and higher education occurs, right? And what I also want to point out is this idea of the swapping of the citizenry, the good ones being brought up and the bad ones being taken down in this kind of almost heaven-hell type paradigm, right, of the ideal city. What's also interesting is that verb used to express that swapping, metalatein, to me, it's kind of somewhat reminiscent of how Timaeus in his cosmogony, I haven't extracted the passage here, but he describes elements, the sublunar elements within space, within Cora, in this state of like perpetually swapping. And he describes Cora as a plokanon, which is like a sieve, like a sifting tool, agrarian tool. And so Cora, the receptacle, is this kind of macrocosmic sifter of all the particles and elements of our sublunar world. Well, in the same way, there's a kind of analogism in the way that the ideal polity, right, that land, which is a Cora, because it's the same word, right, the first instance of the word Cora in the Timaean text is not, you know, when Timaeus introduces that macrocosmic entity, but rather early on when Socrates is here giving his account of, you know, the wicked being plucked out of the above city and sent down, and the noble ones from below being sent up. That switching around of humans within the caste hierarchy of the ideal polity is where the word Cora first occurs. And there it simply means like country or the land, but it has, you know, a particularly distinct connotation there because, of course, in the ideal polity, you have this idea of the citizens being autochthonous, born from the soil, right? And that noble lie, that myth of metals, this idea that the citizenry are born of the soil, smelted metal men brought to life directly by God Himself, that is a huge part of the core ethics that bind them all together in the ideal polity. And so I think that it is, as you've hopefully seen in me laying out all this specific diction of molding and impressing and just generally image making, that it's all connected in this robust way, and that the actual Timaeus's account of cosmogony is designed to fit in really well with Socrates' account of the rearing of humans as statues, because he presents the whole macrocosm as being God's statue. So you have God as the supreme statue maker, and then you have those philosopher kings establishing ideal polities as kind of imitators of the macrocosmic statue maker at the microcosmic level, because they shape their little microcosmic citizens into mini statue equivalents of the divine macrocosm that is also an agama statue. And just as that agama is shaped within a huge macrocosmic mold, so too the citizens are forged in this subterranean chamber, this kora of this subterranean womb, right? That is a forge wherein they're smelted through this kind of mythopoetic tradition of virtual statue making, so to speak. Okay. So now notice in what I've been speaking about, how the particular way in which I've told the myth of metals, I'm insinuating that there is this subterranean forge in which these people are smelted and begotten as living statues, and that then they eventually rise up and become governors if they prove themselves worthy. And by presenting it in that way, what I'm insinuating is the famous myth of the cave, or allegory of the cave, which I've depicted there on the bottom left, wherein, right, there are bound captives who have a wall behind them, who are chained facing forward, famously against a cave wall, where people behind that wall in front of a flame, right, place puppets and create a shadow play in front of the captives. And, famously, the captives are convinced that the shadows on the wall are real entities, and they're not aware of the fact that, no, they're actually a galmata. And Socrates uses that word when he's telling this myth in the text, a galmata, and eidola as well, which is idols, right? Basically the same thing. And then, of course, there is the world above this subterranean prison chamber cave, where there are the real living creatures themselves. And then there are also then the constellations yet above, where there are these living creatures delineating the stars. And then beyond them, right, there is the noetic paradigm, right, the forms, the truly living creatures, the sublime archetypes, right, the paradigms, the forms, the onta, right? So in that whole ontological hierarchy, you can kind of see how, first and foremost, the allegory of the cave gives a general schema and ontology and epistemology that conforms very closely with the whole Timaean cosmogony, right, that we had, with the paradigm being the ultimate source, the true invisible living beings, and then there are like likenesses thereof in the heavens, and then there are the creatures themselves on earth that are the likenesses thereof, the impresses made within Kora, the kind of macrocosmic mold slash womb slash forge type of thing. But people usually separate the noble lie and the myth of metals from the allegory of the cave, whereas I think they're very clearly talking about the same entity. Why wouldn't they be? I'm insinuating that the bound captives are the metal men who are told that they're, smelted directly by God as living statues, and that the projections on the cave wall of the kind of is the censored mythology that these citizens are taught, and they're molded through that process. Because remember, the whole allegory of the cave, Socrates says it's expressly about education and like epistemological progress. Now that diagram, incidentally, the triangular one on the top, indicates it's supposed to represent the myth of metals, right? With the three classes, the golden philosopher kings at the top, the silver warriors class in the middle, and then the bronze and iron lower classes, the demiurgoi, right? The workers, right? And the farmers and hunters and so on. Now, it's worth pointing out that Critias at one point on Stephanus, page 26b in the Timaeus, when he's talking about his recollection of his performance of Solon's Atlantis poem as a kid in the Apaturia feast on the day of Kuriotis, if you recall, right, the day when youths were initiated into citizenship. He says that he very much enjoyed, it was a great source of like playful delight to him when he was listening to the elders who were enthusiastically teaching. And he was asking a lot for details and further explanations and confirmations and so on. And as a youth, being instructed by the tribal elders, and he says that the information given therefrom was like burnt into, like seared into my memory in a manner that it remains like a kind of graphe, painting or writing, same word, that can't be scrubbed away, that can't be washed away, that's like permanently seared into me. Now, the reason that's significant is he's showing the same sort of theme that's explored in Book 2 of the Republic, namely that the mythic education and musical and gymnastic education given to children molds and shapes their soul permanently. And if they're given a great noble poem, remember, because it's said expressed in the text that this Atlantis poem, were it finished, would be better than Homer and Hesiod. What's being said then is that Critias, the reason he's such an excellent man is because he was shaped by a poem that was better than Homer and Hesiod in his youth. He had that rare opportunity to be formed in that way. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that Socrates emphasizes in his account of education, he emphasizes the idea that like supervision is required to impose shaping of the soul through music and gymnastics. There's this like rigid system of control. And so what's fascinating is that the actual overall schema of the Republic itself, not only does it have this repeated emphasis on the diction of statue making, but I think there's an argument to be made. It's been made by another scholar before me whose works I've put there that you can look up the articles. They're quite interesting. But it's been argued that if you take all the mythic scenes and images, or the imagistic portions, let's say, of the Republic, and line them up, what you end up with is something like a pediment, right? The famous triangles, so to speak, at the top of Greek temples, wherein there are statues arranged with kind of different scenes that all come together, right? And what I mean by that is this. So the Republic starts with a famous depiction of Cephalus, the host, an aged man, kind of enthroned in a manner, and he's described almost as if he's like an enthroned statue of Zeus, right? So it's like the opening scene. And the final scene, the famous myth of which warrants its own treatment, right? It's this myth, this eschatological tale of a man, an Armenian called who dies and whose soul goes on a wild journey and sees the judgment of the dead, and then he comes back to life and remembers it all. Right? Well, in that vision, he sees famously like a lady necessity enthroned with her like spinning her like cosmic wheels amidst the sirens in the infrastructure of heaven, the rotational bands of heaven. So all of that with her spindle in the middle. So all of that essentially, particularly Lady Necessity enthroned, constitutes a kind of statue. And then in between, you have lots and lots of statue blocks. So you have the myth of metals that we're going to talk about more, and I've already mentioned in book 2, as well as the myth of the Ring of Guges, rather famous one that inspired Tolkien, right? The Ring of Invisibility, wherein there's mention of the ring being found within like a bronze hollow horse that's found in like a subterranean tomb in a katabatic scene. So again, that's like another scene in the wider frieze, let's say, like in the wider temple pediment, just like those horses that you see up there at the top. You can conceive of that bronze horse in the Guges myth as yet another scene in the pediment. There's also like in book 8, the extensive description of geometric schemata that make up the ideal number for breeding citizens that we're going to discuss, but that too can form a scene. And of course, famously, as we've already mentioned prior, Socrates and Glaucon saying that they are acting as sculptors, andriantopoioi, statue makers, in producing images of the just man and the evil man. And I think it's in book 9, I believe, where there's an account of like the evil tyrant's soul, and it's described as like some kind of lion-like monstrosity on the inside with an outer shell that is like a statue of a man. So again, it's statue-based imagery, and it's like an iconistic way of showing one's psychology through that, for lack of a better word, metaphor. But that again produces yet another image for this pediment. So if you go through meticulously all the key phases of the Republic and imagine them as icones, as icons, you end up with this kind of construction of a wider pediment, so to speak. And we can also see here a triangular diagram that lays out the forms of government, right? Aristocracy, democracy, oligarchy, democracy, tyranny, and it places them on a scale alongside the levels of epistemology, right? Which are laid out in the famous divided line, which is also related to the allegory of the cave, right? With the highest supreme level of reasoning pertaining to being, and then an ancillary and close level of dianoia, understanding, and then mere opinion, and ultimately just conjecture, pistis, all laid out. And that corresponds with the forms of government in like sort of descending order. And then that also corresponds with the tripartite soul. So the appetite, the epithematicon, right? The desirous part, associated with like the hunger, the bowels, and sexual desire of the groin. The spirited part of the chest. Those two are the mortal components of the soul. And then nous, the intelligent, immortal, astral part of the soul. And that's quite significant because, as we're going to see later, I think that the tripartite soul and these kind of governmental and epistemological distinctions can be mapped onto the macrocosm of Timaeus and his conception of man as a microcosm as well, and even imbued into the very structure of the text, which I would argue is also agalmatic, right, statue-like. So we'll look at that later. But it's worth pointing out again that many would would contest my identification of the myth of metals with the allegory of the cave. But I think there is good reason to presume that they are one and the same thing, given that Socrates does expressly say that the allegory of the cave is concerned expressly with education. And furthermore, this whole emphasis on shadows created, idol are shadows, and phantasmata, right, shadows created by agalmata in motion, is very reminiscent of how Socrates, when he said, remember at Stephanus page 19b to see at the beginning, the incipit of the Timaeus, he says, I want to see my polity like animated in a state of war, like a zoon, a painted animal or a living animal that is initially still, but then is brought to motion. That's kind of reminiscent of this puppet play. And then the further connections that I've already outlined with image making and Korah and statues and so on, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's still more to say about that, because all these themes again occur in Timaeus' account of the liver that we're going to see. But just in order for things to make sense, it's just worth, in case people don't know, quickly recapitulating how class and the tripartite soul are conceived of in Socrates' ideal republic. So, as I've mentioned, nous is the astral eternal component of the soul, the mind, right? The intellect. Thymos is like the spirited part of man. And then epithymeticon is the desirous part associated with like the bowels and the groin. And each of those can be identified with one of the three classes of the ideal polity. Now, in the diagram I have there, you have the guardians, the phyloches at the top, then you have the epikuroi, the auxiliaries, and then you have the demiurgoi, the craftsmen at the bottom. And they're identified with reason, i.e. nous, with spirit, thymos, and then desire, the epithymeticon. Now, I would probably make it differ slightly. I'd probably put, instead of guardians at the top, I'd say philosopher kings, right, who are the elite guardians, who are equivalent to like the hieratic caste of Sais in Egypt. And then I would put the phyloches in the middle as the spirited part. And remember, you can map the three kinds of metal races from the famous myth of metals onto this, right? You have the golden philosopher kings, you have the silver phyloches and auxiliaries, and then you have the bronze and iron craftsmen, right? Because remember, the whole point of that myth is that Socrates explains that God smelts the humans out of the earth as living statues, and he makes them out of different ingredients: gold, the most philosophic kind; silver, the warrior kind; and then bronze and iron, the workers, right? And it's taught that one must do according to one's nature, and that is actually how he defines justice within the ideal polity. It's each component doing its designated part. If you are a gold man, you are to be a philosopher king. That is your nature. That is your duty. If you are a silver man, you are to be a warrior. That is your duty. If you are a bronze man, you are to be a farmer or a hunter, or a craftsman, right? So it's just interesting that you have components of the tripartite soul of an individual human corresponding with the strata of society. You're at the hierarchies. And then furthermore, the three kind of narrative cycles of the monologue of Timaeus, the cosmogony, that I've mentioned in passing, those three sections kind of also correspond with a sector of the body-soul compound and of the three-tiered class system, right? So the first narrative cycle concerned with astronomy and the words and thoughts of the demiurge himself and the paradigm and so on, all that fittingly can be designated as like dealing with reason, with nous. And then the second narrative cycle dealing with Korah and the receptacle and how these images imprint. And remember, Korah is described as a plokanon, right, as a sieve, like as this ever-shaking, ever-moving entity. So fittingly, that's to do with like necessity, and with the class of the phyloches, right, the military class of the guardians, who are like these movers and shakers in the sense that they're not just the military enforcers, but they're also the ones who are always moving people around to ensure that they're placed in the right class, right? Oh, that man's too smart to be a craftsman. We've got to take him up to be educated to become a philosopher king. And oh, this philosopher king, we're wrong about him. He's a dodo. We've got to drag him back down into the prison of the cave, the forgery, to be re-educated, so to speak, as a craftsman. So that moving about of the constituents of the city that that middle class, the phyloches, the guardians, engage in, is analogous to the role of necessity and Korah as this kind of sifter and rearranger, right, within the divine macrocosm. So Timaeus is structuring his account of reality, of cosmogony, to fit the structures of Socrates' ideal polity. But conversely, too, it should be conceived of Socrates as building his city as an imitation of the divine macrocosm and its origin and its dynamic, right? Because Timaeus' account is not merely a fiction, it's an accurate imitation of the divine reality. That's what makes it true. And then lastly, the third narrative cycle of Timaeus, which deals with anatomy and mechanical cooperation and interaction between reason and necessity. Fittingly, that very meaty kind of anatomical part of the dialogue is associated with the lower class and with the epitharmeticon, which, whilst they're like rowdy and base and grotty, right, there's this sense in which, nonetheless, they are that both the epithymeticon and the lower parts of our body, right, like the bowels and the genitalia, all that stuff, whilst it's a bit grotty, it's like it's necessary for us to be sustained, right? So to those classes, we may, they may be rowdy and need to be controlled and not be very bright in this conception, right? But nonetheless, they're super essential for survival, right? So you can see it's quite interesting that the structure of the city, the structure of the cosmos, and then the anatomical and psychological structure of man totally correspond with each other, right? Now, before I expand more on that, I just want to take a look here now at the liver, at Timaeus' account of the liver, which is often not given due attention. Okay, so we'll turn to this portion of the text now that I've extracted here, where it's describing how the gods are placing the soul into the human body frame, okay? And we've established that the immortal soul, right, that has two bands of rotation, just like the band of the same and the different, right? The ecliptic and the sphere of the fixed stars, in the case of the kind of astronomical infrastructure of the divine mind of the visible macrocosm, right, animated by the anima mundi, and how our nous soul, right, our intelligent soul within the head, the spherical head, that's much like the spherical heaven of the universe, of the visible universe. Those bands are mixed from the same ingredients, right? That was established in a former passage. Now it's describing in the last of the Timaeus's three narrative cycles, the monologue, I should say, the cosmogonic monologue, in the heavily anatomical portion of the last articulation of the story, the third time. Here it's describing the gods, how they bind the epithymeticon, right, the lowest part of the mortal soul, because the mortal soul is both the thymos and the epithymeticon, right? The nous is immortal, it goes back up to the stars, but the implication is that the thymos and the epithymeticon, right, the midriff portion and lower bowel and groin portion of our soul is mortal, it dies with the body, it's kind of just like an animating force of the body that's kind of temporal, that's not so much part of the eternal new soul that goes back to heaven and that was initially seeded in heaven, right? It's instead of being a creation of the demiurge himself, this immortal new soul, the mortal soul, the epithymeticon and the thymos were created by the planetary gods themselves, the sub-demiurges, as opposed to the supreme god himself. Now, just prior to this passage, I haven't extracted it here, but the heart is described as like a guard chamber, which I think is very significant, because I'm arguing, right, that the thymos is to be identified with the guardians, the phylaces, the military class, and it's fitting, right, because the heart is like this guardhouse of the body as the central blood pump, right? So, and that's also the seat of the thymos, which is the spirited, like zesty, angry, zealous part of our mortal soul that kind of animates us into action, which is exactly what the military class of the phylaces do, right? And it's important to understand that Timaeus emphasized that part, the thymos part of our anatomy, like takes orders from the head, just like the military class closely follows the orders of the Acropolis of the philosopher kings. And and indeed, when he's talking about the guardhouse of the heart, he expressly refers to the like command center of the head as an acropolis, right? So he's very clearly mapping the structure of the ideal polity's political hierarchy onto the anatomy of the body soul compound, right? But now we're turning to this passage where he's speaking about how the astral gods, the subdemiurges, are implanting the epithymeticon, that mortal appetitive part of the soul in the body. So that epithymeticon of the soul, which is concerned with food and drink and all the other things which the body needs to make strong its nature, that was positioned between the phrenes, like between like the midriff chest region, and the navel. And the term used for like implanted is actually katorkisan, which means like to settle in the sense of like colonial settlement, right? It's a very human word, and it's also a word that's very political in the sense of like populating a region, right? So this part of the soul is being spoken about as if it were like a body of citizens being implanted in a section of the polis, right? That's not coincidental language. And then it says, the text says that this it becomes like a fasner, like a animal feeding trough in all of this region of the body. The gods tektenamenoi, right, like as carpenters crafted this region of the body as a feeding trough. So again, we have this combination of like artisanal language of carpentry, but also like the concept of biological feeding and animal husbandry. So there's this perpetual mixing of the biological breeding and growing and feeding, but also the artisanal crafting, always worked into each other. So that's what the gods create in the body. And then it says, the text says, I've bolded the verb katedesan, right? They tied up, they bound the epithymeticon within this portion of the torso, as if it were like a wild animal, a wild beast that would be fed there and kept in place through necessity. And this was necessary for there to be a mortal like race. Now, I want to point out that language of binding the epithymeticon, I don't think that binding is a coincidental usage. Yeah, you can find parallels like in medical texts of that verb, but I think there's clearly an allusion with that use of the verb binding to the prisoners within the cave of the famous Allegory of the Cave. Now, why do I say that? Why should this beast that is bound within the cave of the torso, why should it be likened to the prisoners of the cave shown, the phantasmata, right, the shadowy images on the cave wall in a subterranean chamber in a cave? Well, we're going to see why I draw that connection very shortly. So the text goes on. So they wanted the epithymeticon to like dwell far away from the reasoning center, the head that is, by feeding in its manger, so to speak. And so they settled it, katoikun, again, that same word, they settled it in that region so that it would cause a minimal amount of tumult and outcry, and instead it would be the more powerful entity, that is the reasoning faculty, that would be at peace and would be able to make decisions and plans for the benefit of the whole, in accordance with what was in the interest of the whole, right? Now, again, there is a likeness here to the philosopher kings in their Acropolis engaging in pure dialectic and reasoning and being at peace, And for them to be at peace, they need the hoi polloi, right, the low classes, the demiurges, the bronze and iron men, who are ruckus causers, much as they are in Homer in the Hesiotic cosmology, right? Which is where these races of metals obviously come from, right? The Hesiotic tradition. The bronze men need to be kept down in the cave prison and kept entertained, right, with these phantasmata in the cave of shadows, the shadow puppet play, right? Well, in the same way, the epithymeticon, we shall see, needs to be kept quiet and kept from rebellion by being kept down in its cave so that it doesn't interfere with the intellection of the head, which is analogous to the philosopher kings. So the appetitive part of the soul, the epithymeticon, is like the ruckusy hoi polloi, right? And so the text goes on and says, since the gods knew that this part of the mortal soul, the epithymeticon, would never participate in logos, in reasoning, but rather could only participate in some kind of like dim, defective sensory perception. They knew that like there was no intrinsic reasoning capacity, no participation in logoi in this mortal part of the soul concerned with appetites, eating, and sex, right? So instead, they decided that the epithymeticon was to be psychagogically guided, right, through the use of idola and phantasmata, right, shadowy images, dreamlike images, both by day and by night. And so God devised that. It's interesting that randomly there's this change to the singular God when we're supposed to be talking about the astral gods, right? There's almost an implication that this particular design of the liver was something that had to come not from the astral sub-demiurges, but rather from the supreme demiurge himself, because it's so important. And I really think it is. We're going to see that this description of the mechanics of the liver is actually really central to how the whole cosmogony is to be conceived and how the whole polity of Socrates is to be conceived. We'll get to that. So the epithymeticon is to be guided psychagogically by through the use of idola and phantasmata, right? These shadowy images that are projected in a manner analogous to the puppet play of the cave of the Republic, right? So so God conceived of the form of the liver and put it together and placed it in its habitation. Again, katoikis is this highly political word of colonizing like a people group in a spot, right? The liver is colonized therein, okay, for this purpose. And he made it like dense and smooth and bright and sweet and also bitter, so that the potency, the power, the dunamis brought down from the nous, from the intelligence of the head, could impart therein its dianoemata, right? So remember, noesis is like the highest epistemological level, right? That pertains to the onta, the form's being itself, right? And so the head can impart the logoi, the reasoning that's unique to phronesis, right? To rotational cognition of the heavenly soul in the head, the immortal one. It can impart those forms, that reasoning, right, to the lower part of the mortal soul that has no capacity for reason, right, and that solely is dominated by appetites, that is a bound beast growling, right, causing noise and a ruckus and disturbance. It has no capacity for reason. Nonetheless, the orderly patterns of reasoned thought can be imparted to the rumbling agro animal imprisoned in the cave of the torso through the projection of dreamlike shadowy images, phantasmata and idola, onto the surface of the liver. That is a kind of smooth screen for cinematography, so to speak, right? For shadow puppet play. And so what's implicit in all of this is the idea that unreasoning entities like the desirous appetitive part of the mortal soul, the epithymedicon, but also like low tier citizens, right? Like farmers and craftsmen, the demiurgoi, the bronze and iron men of the metal, the myth of metals and the ideal polity, they can be psychagogically guided through a kind of psyop, if you will, um, which uses dreamlike images, projections on a screen, right? So the shadow puppet play of the liver is used to control base entities that cannot participate in true reasoning and noesis and cannot perceive the forms as they truly are and perceive of being and the onta and the paradigm. Only philosophers can do that. So the unphilosophic, unreasoning entities, they can only be guided by philosophical ones through creation of a shadow puppet play. Because the whole myth of metals, right, is a kind of elaborate shadow puppet play put on for the unreasoning citizens by the philosopher kings who are equivalent to the nous within the human microcosmic body, right? Okay, and so returning to the text, it says that he, in the same manner as a mirror receives the tupoi, right, the imprints, and one can see the eidola, right, the shadows or the images therein, the idols, so to speak. So in that manner, the nous is able to intimidate the epithymedicon, right? So in the same way, right, the ruckusy iron men and bronze men of the myth of metals and the ideal polity who are kept in the subterranean prison cave, who have to be bound through the infrastructure of myth telling. It's a like to a cinema screen, right? Cinematography of this shadow play of intimidating images that both captivate but also create fear in the populace, right? It's this kind of almost CIA-like psyop of keeping base, unreasoning, unphilosophic people in line through a kind of cinematographic projection, right? That imparts wisdom to beings that are inherently incapable of participating in logos, in reasoning. It's quite an interesting scenario. Now, the text I've left a bit out, but the text goes on to say, so in an opposite way, so as opposed to intimidation through such image projection, there is also like an outbreathing, like a smooth breath, an outpouring of breath from the intellect that bears a kind of humility and self-control, and this outbreath of intellect paints or draws apos do graphoi, fantastical images, right? Phantasmata. And this breathing out from the intellect, which paints these phantasmata, also provides like a sense of peace that results in the epithymedicon no longer being like shaken up and intimidated, but rather is like brought out of bitterness through sweetness, and can be like directed to be more calm. Okay, so the portion of the soul that is made to inhabit, that is colonized, right, katorkis menen, around the liver, is rendered euemeron, right, is rendered like calm and hileon, right, and like of good spirit, right, hilarious, so to speak, like happy, right, through the smoothness of these projected images. So they can be used to frighten and intimidate, but also to like subdue and bring about like softness and joy. Okay. And what's really interesting is the bolded last line there, is that, so just before that, the text says that during the night, the epithymedicon is made to have conduct that is like moderate and temperate, right? And that during sleep, the mantic art is used because at that time the soul cannot participate in logos, right, in like reasoning, dialectic reasoning, or in phronesis, right, rotational cognition. So what does this last part mean? Now, in light of certain Hippocratic texts, namely De Victu, as is its Latin title, right? A kind of Hippocratic text that is in many ways very kind of Heraclitean. There in that text, there's an account of sleep as involving like all the scattered parts of the soul that are scattered throughout the body, gathering in one point, right? Presumably somewhere in the torso. Now, I think that something analogous is going on here in Timaeus' account of how dreams work. When he says that the soul cannot participate in reasoning and phronesis, right, rotational cognition during sleep, and when he says that there's a breath that comes out from the intellection that goes down and paints on the surface of the liver, I think this is understood literally as what happens in sleep is you're no longer thinking rationally, right? You can't engage in dialectic and beholding of the pure forms and so on when you're asleep. Your nous, right, vacates your head, so to speak, and travels down into your torso and literally breathes out this, magical dialectic noetic breath that paints on the surface of the liver like a shadow puppet show for the bound, raging epithymedicon that's imprisoned below. And this idea, right, of the philosopher king having to come down into the cave where are the bound captives in order to conduct mythopoeia, right, in order to engage in myth making and image production, in order to mold the body soul compounds of his metal men citizens. Socrates expressly calls that a necessity. He says that as brilliant as it is for a philosopher king to be perpetually engaging in pure dialectic, he nonetheless has to be humble and come back down. And he says, go back down into the cave. He actually uses that catabatic language. He says the philosopher king must go back down into the cave in order to preach, as it were, amidst the prisoners. It's almost analogous to kind of how the Gospel of Nicodemus describes Christ, having to go down to the bowels of the earth, into the underworld to preach to the captives. It's the same sort of dynamic. Of course, the whole catabatic cave thing certainly does have hints of like the underworld present in it, right? Of like the Orphic catabasis kind of situation. And since I mentioned the whole Christ going down to the underworld, it's worth mentioning also in passing that in the context of the allegory of the cave in the Republic, it's said that Socrates asks, like rhetorically, what do you think would befall a philosopher king, like if he spoke of the forms to those bound in the cave who only knew like the false images of the phantasmata and the idola projected onto the cave wall? And he says that they would like anastaurosai the philosopher king, and that very word is basically the same verb that's used for the crucifixion of Christ, right? Who's in some sense like the logos come down into the lowly world of the cave, the world of illusion, who's like rejected by the people in the cave and who's given that treatment, right? That being strung up. At any rate, so what I would suggest though is that all this image making with the liver, I think that the whole icastic myth can sort of be conceived of as oneiromantic in character. Now, what do I mean by that? So we mentioned that the epithymedicon can't participate of reason, neither can the bronze men and iron men imprisoned in the cave. So they have to be given like a shadow puppet play as a substitute for reasoning. And that shadow puppet play, because it's structured by the reasoning philosopher kings or the intellect of the head, it is noble and it can impart the nobility of noesis and the forms to entities that could not otherwise participate and that need the intermediation of images. Okay, so what's interesting though is Timaeus says that it's necessary to use the mantic art. So what I think is going on here is that like priestly religion and myth making is an exercise engaged in by noble illumined philosophers in order to impart their wisdom, their dialectic wisdom, to individuals who can't reach that high philosophic level, but still need the guidance. And so the guidance and the shaping comes in the form of that imagery that molds them in the correct way, even though they're not really understanding it, right? It's like subconscious. Okay, but what I think is going on is the whole Timaean myth of the divine macrocosm being sculpted as an agalma, as a living statue, and likewise the noble lie, the myth of metals, wherein citizens are crafted as living statues. This whole enterprise of image making, iconopoeia, and mythopoeia, right, myth making, that whole enterprise is a kind of inherently oneiromantic thing, right? That is, oneiromancy, right, is the divine art of interpreting dreams. I would actually argue that all of these phantasmata and idola, that these images, these icones that are created through mythopoetic discourse, the whole thing is a kind of shadow puppet play or elaborate dream world. In fact, in the Republic, there actually are uses of the verb for dreaming, oneiropolor, right, or oneiropoleo. And it also, I should have extracted these passages, but I forgot to, but Cora, the receptacle, is also described through that same oniric diction. Because as Timaeus is kind of struggling to explain the ontological status of the receptacle Cora in between becoming and being, because Cora is neither really becoming or being, but rather the veil between the two, the intermediary between the two. In struggling to explain it, he says it's like a kind of dream world. It's like when someone tries to explain Cora, they enter into a kind of like dream state. But I think the whole Aikos mythos is a kind, and so too the whole world of the allegory of the cave and the myth of the metals. That whole state is a kind of dream state. And this element of like the dream image, and awakening from the dream and using reason to interpret dream imagery is a central dynamic at play in the Timaeus and the Republic that really is understudied and underappreciated, that I've only cottoned onto through this kind of detailed analysis of this liver passage, because I haven't included it here, but Timaeus goes on to explain how divine possession works. He says, like, people can be divinely possessed by a divinity. They speak truths, but they're actually cognizant of what they've said because they were out of their wits when the God made this promulgation through them. And then after that, after that revelation in which they're out of their wits, they have to then come to their senses and apply reason to what was said and what was revealed. And only by applying their divine reason to the analysis of what was uttered from above through them, so to speak, only then can they make sense of it. So too, Timaeus says, dreams too, you get these divine images, but you then when you awake and your mind, right, that had gone down in sleep into the torso chamber to paint for the epithymedicon, the bound beast, to guide and direct it and calm it or terrorize it. When the mind comes back up, you awaken from sleep, right? And then when you awaken, you have to try and recall what you saw, the idola and phantasmata that you saw in your dream. And then much like the enlightened prisoner in the cave whose bindings burst, right, who wakes up and who turns around and who sees the source of the flame and the agalmata, the moving statues, and then goes out and sees the real world above. So too, in the same way, when you wake up from sleep, you analyze the dream images that you saw, and you connect them to the real world, and you assess things rationally. Right? I think that whole dynamic is very important. And let us not forget that at the very beginning of Timaeus' speech, when he gives his prologue, he says that discourses, logoi, are exegetai, exegetes of the phenomenon which they treat. And remember, that term is a term for a special kind of priest who's like a neuromancer, like an interpreter of dreams. And so I don't think that that dropping of that term is a coincidence. I think the whole thing serves to frame Timaeus as a kind of exegete, a kind of expert neuromancer who's capable of kind of entering the world of phantasmata and mythic images, and then this sub-rational dream world state of Korah, and then awakening from that divine revelation, that dream, and then using his reason to dialectically prove how all of this is actually cohesive and relates ultimately to the archetypes, right, to the forms, to the onta, through impressive intellection and rationality. So the idea of like religious revelation and dialectic reasoning, they're not at odds, but they're necessary cooperators, right? Is the idea at play here. Okay. Okay, try and go to the next slide. All right, so I mentioned before the idea that there are the three narrative cycles of the Timaean monologue, okay? I've delineated them there with the Stephanus pages, the relevant Stephanus pages, and I think they can be mapped onto sectors of the human body compound. So the first narrative cycle dealing with the stars and planets and the rotational cognition of the phronesis, right, of the divine macrocosm, that fits rather well with the philosopher kings, who are like the head, the acropolis of the polity. And so too, it maps on rather neatly with the human head. And if you actually divide up the proportionality of the scroll of the text, the very point at which the luminaries of heaven are discussed correlates with our little luminaries, right? Our globular shining eyes. So to the speech that the demiurge himself gives at Stephan's page 42, I think, correlates exactly with where our mouth is positioned and so on. In fact, Bragg, a modern scholar, francophone scholar, has very compellingly argued that you can grab the proportions of the famous sculpture of the Doryphorus, the spear-wielding man, famously developed by Polyclitus, who also had an accompanying literary tractate called the Canon of Polyclitus that laid out the proportionate ratios of the perfect human form, that if you map that onto the dialogue's contents, it fits perfectly. And I think that's very compelling, particularly given everything that I've said about the myth of metals and the Phylakes, right, the spearmen, the ideal warrior philosopher kings being like molded through myths. And I think the Timaeus is one of those very myths that Socrates would have loved to have used for the youths of his ideal polity to be shaped into perfect images of the divine. Okay, so we'll get to that shortly. But so that's the first section equivalent to the head. Then the midsection dealing with Korah and necessity and the thymos is equivalent to like the midsection, and then the bottom section, of course, right, with its emphasis on anatomy, corresponds well with the epithymeticon, like the necessary bowels and guts that, hunger for sustenance and that process food and so on. And also, the genitalia that are the source of generation. In fact, the account of reincarnation, and the most detailed one in the Timaeus itself, occurs like in the late Stephanus pages of the dialogue, right at the very end, which is proportionally sort of, you could place it where the genitalia are on the human statue. Now, I've extracted here some passages from the Republic that I think are very important as intertexts vis-a-vis the Timaeus. So in Book 6, Stephan's page 500e, we have Socrates say that Apollos cannot truly thrive and be eudaimonic, so to speak, less truly blessed and divine, if it is not written out diagrapsean through the use of a divine paradigm, right? Theoparadigmati, right? And the people who draw out the ideal polity are conceived of as zographoi, right? That is, as painters. So this is highly significant, and people often gloss over this passage and don't realize its important connection to the Timaeus, right? If you recall earlier, I mentioned a passage where Socrates likens Hesiod and Homer to like painters whose image doesn't resemble the archetype, right? When he says that their depictions of the gods don't really resemble the ideal conception of divinity. Well, in the same way, he here is talking in a similar manner about polity founders, right? The philosopher kings who in the Republic itself are the speakers themselves, who are in words, in discourse, in logos, founding and generating a virtual ideal city, right? As we've already established. He describes them as painters. Recall that Stephanus, page 19b, where Socrates at the beginning of the Timaeus says, I want to see my polity animated as a moving storm, a living animal / painting thereof. Right? He, before in his discourse on the ideal polity, has the philosopher kings acting as painters who are using a paradigm in order to write out a divine paradigm, I might add. Recall my comments about the paradigm being identifiable with the thoughts of God, and that's the very essence of nous, the demiurge, i.e. the supreme divine mind. But so the philosopher kings as painters, as zographoi, animal painters, so to speak, rely on a divine paradigm to produce a constitution that is described as a kind of sketch, a diagraphe, right? Through that verb diagraphein, which is where we get like diagram in English, right? So you can think of it as a constitutional diagram. So recall in Timaeus' prologue, where he describes the demiurges looking to that which is eternal and ever consistent with itself. And he uses the phrase proskromenos paradigmati, right? The demiurge uses or relies upon a paradigm. And that chromenos paradigmati is exactly the same diction that occurs in Socrates' description of the philosopher kings founding a polity through speech, acting as zographoi, painters. So both the founders of the ideal polity in speech and the demiurge creating the world, both are conceived of as implicitly as painters, zographoi, right, using a paradigma, using a paradigm. Now, even one might object and say, well, Timaeus never expressly calls the demiurge a painter. Well, I beg to differ. It depends what you call express. At one point, Timaeus is talking about the mixing of colors, and he says, only God can truly understand exactly how pigments are mixed to create colors. You know, human understanding will always be flawed. So by calling God the supreme and sole knower of how pigments and colors are mixed, he's implicitly calling him a painter. But not only that, at 55c, Stephanus, page 55c, we see Timaeus is just finished articulating the different elements and how the demiurge creates mathematically as a geometer the different solids embodying the elements. So the tetrahedron being fire, the cube being earth, the octahedron being air, the icosahedron being water. And then the last solid that remains to be shaped is the dodecahedron. And when Timaeus explains how the demiurge creates that, he says that there was still to be composed, right, the fifth shape. And so God used it all up, so to speak, when he was sketching it out, when he was sketching out the all, i.e. the universe. So topan diasdographon. Now, that's a bit ambiguous. What does that mean? So what it means to say is that in making all the elements and the geometrical structures thereof, all of the visible ingredients of the initially unmusical and wild, disordered cosmic soup, right? The demiurge has used up those things in creating all these geometric and elemental structures. But the last thing that remains to do is to create the kind of outer rim of the cosmos that's almost spherical, because the dodecahedron is very much alike via sphere, which is the ultimate shape of the all and the paradigm, right? The implication is that the noetic animal is the perfect sphere, so to speak, whereas the visible macrocosm is almost a sphere, but the firmament containing everything is a kind of dodecahedron, an almost sphere. And that verb diasdographon, I think the zdor component in there is highly significant. If Timaeus just said diagraphon, then we could conceive of the exterior as merely a dodecahedral diagram. But it's not just that. I think it's implicitly due to that zdor component inserted in the participle diasdographon. I think implicitly this dodecahedron is decorated with zdor, with animals, that is, constellations, right? And that makes sense of why it's designated the dodecahedron, because remember, the band of the different that is interlinked with the band of the same. The band of the same is identified by Timaeus with the firmament of the fixed stars, whereas the band of the different is the ecliptic, right? The band of the zodiac through which the sun travels in what constitutes the year, right? So I think implicit in all this is, and also I should add that the fifth solid in the text of the Timaeus is not officially assigned an element. The other solids are, each solid is given a sublunar element, but clearly, I think, the fifth element, the quintessential element, I mean, in case you didn't know, right, that's where we get our word quintessential. Something is vital, it's important. It's the quinta, the fifth, essentia, right, essence, substance. So that, I think that implicit in all this is that the heavenly firmament of the stars with its animal-like constellational beings, right? It's stars door. That dodecahedral firmament is made out of a sublime super element, which is implicitly ether. Now, he never says that, and in fact, when the word ether does occur in the text as a kind of air, it's used differently, but I don't think that precludes this fifth element being ether. David Sedley has an article with a very compelling argument interpreting the Cratylus as putting forward ether as a fifth element. And then there's much in Proclus's commentary on the Timaeus about ether as a fifth element. And then the Orphics of late antiquity do very interesting things with that fifth element of ether. But at any rate, we'll leave that aside because someone can call that later developments. We don't want to impute that to the early original Platonic text per se. But all I simply want to draw attention to is that participle diasdographon, aside from having that zdor component inside of it, which connects it to the zdorgraphoi of the political constitution founders of the ideal polity in the Republic, what I think needs to be appreciated here is that Socrates refers in the Republic to the divine paradigm of the ideal polity being laid out somewhere beyond the stars. So I think what is going on with that is that the paradigm which the philosopher kings use to found through dialectic the ideal polity is implicitly one and the same with Timaeus's noetic animal, his divine paradigm. But the demiurge, in crafting that starry dodecahedral firmament that is a kind of zdorgraphia because it is adorned with paintings of animals, when he says, when the demiurge says to the sub-demiurges, right, the astral and planetary divinities who create the sublunar creation, he says to them, like, follow the pattern that I laid out in my creating of you, O ye, planetary astral gods. What I think is implicit in that is that he, as a zdorgraphos, has like painted out blueprints in star patterns, right? So like you will create like snakes on Earth and humans on Earth and bears on Earth and so on and so on, and crabs, because I've made, the Cancer constellation, and I've made Gemini, and I've made Draco, and so on. And in the stars, I've painted out these blueprints for you to use on Earth. The text doesn't expressly say that, but I think it's actually implicit in the conceptual framework. And we'll get to why I think that. But it's also interesting to point out, as I've extracted there, Stephanus page 501, that Plato Socrates emphasizes that before the ideal polity can be instituted, one needs to wipe the slate clean. And he refers literally to like a pinax, like a surface on which writing or painting occurs, need to be like scrubbed clean. Again, implying that punning on this idea of graphein nomos, right? You write out laws as like statutes, as charters, but in the same way you like paint them out as like animals, right? There's always this bizarre pun that I don't think has been duly appreciated, this double play of like grapho as being both write and paint or draw, and this idea that the enterprise of establishing a city and a constitution is an element, involves acting as a zographos, a painter, and in so doing, one is to look to the heavenly paradigm of the stars and the noetic animal beyond the stars, who is the blueprint of the stars. A philosopher king has to look to all that, to the heavenly paradigm, in order to act as a zographos in producing his diagraphe, right? His diagrammatic constitution. And just as both the creator God and the philosopher king are both painters, dographoi, I think so too, both the constitution of the ideal polity, but also the structure of heaven can both be considered diagraphe, that is, diagrammatic constitutions. Because I think the demiurge is not only a creator of heaven, but implicitly he's a creator of the ideal polity as well, because he lays out the diagram of heaven, that dodecahedral structure, and the mathematical order of heaven. Because remember, Chronos is the moving image of eternity, right? The sky, time embodied in the moving celestial bodies, is the visible eikon image of the invisible noetic paradigm, right? The form, the totality of the forms, right? The divine mind. So heaven is the divine mind made visible. But also it is the craftsmanship of God, and as such, it is his diagraphe, because he's expressly said to be diastographon, right? He's a painter producing a diagraphe, which is a kind of delineation in geometry, but is also implicitly like a political structure. Now, how it is that heaven constitutes a political structure is complicated. In the Eponomus, we're told that like heaven, the supreme God, as is said in that text, teaches mankind through number, and man learnt number through gazing at the stars. A similar kind of worldview is laid out in the Cratylus as well, with the stars as like the original divinities and teachers of humankind. But the exact mechanism of the diagraphe of the dodecahedral heavens, we're going to see how that works shortly. But something that's interesting, I've spoken so much about this motif of statue crafting in the ideal polity, and the ideal polity's central cosmogonic myth, which is the Timaeus, right? Because Timaeus is to be understood as like eclipsing Homer and Hesiod and providing the ultimate creation story, the ultimate myth for the shaping of the ideal agalmatic citizenry, right? The ideal metal statue men for Socrates' perfect polity. Now, what's interesting is, as I've mentioned already here in Book 9, Stephanus page 592, Socrates says, now in what we've gone through thus far in our discussion, in inhabiting our city as we speak, right? And he uses that participle oikizontes, right? Like settling, colonizing, with peopling, right? In the sense of like a territory, a city. So we've like, through our speech, we've peopled the city. And he says, this city that lies in logoi, right? In speech, in thoughts, is laid out in speech or thoughts, laid out in logoi, but also in ratios, because logos is a ratio as well. And remember, the anima mundi animating heaven is like ratios, right? Heaven is number and time embodied, right? So he's identifying, as we're going to see, Socrates actually identifies in this passage his ideal city with the kind of astronomico-mathematical infrastructure of heaven. So he says, we've gone through already in our discourse, we've inhabited this city through our speech, and it is laid out it exists in logoi, right? It's a virtual city, a logic city. And it is neither on earth, this city. I do not think that this earth is that this city is totally on earth, but rather I think that there is some paradigm, right? Some blueprint, some paradigm, somewhere maybe in heaven it lies. And he who wishes to see it has to make himself a citizen of what he sees there. He has to, like, again, that verb katoi kisde, right? He has to, like, colonize himself. So you have to become a master astronomer, philosopher, and project yourself up into that heavenly city of number and pure reason, of pure logos, through dialectic. And it's interesting that after hearing that, his interlocutor Glaucus says, yes, it would seem so. And the word he uses there, akos, right, is very, it's cognate, right, with the akos mythos, right, and all those icastic verbs of depiction through images. And someone could say it's purely coincidental, but I don't think it is, given everything we've discussed and given the occurrence here of that par excellence artistic word of paradigma, right? Paradigm, blueprint. At any rate, now another passage that I think is much neglected and that is very important in the Republic is in Book 6, Septimus, page 501b, where we encounter Socrates saying this. And afterwards, I think, they should work densely, looking out this way, towards that which is in its nature just and beautiful and moderate and all such things. And looking towards that, they should imbue into humans that quality, mixing the perfect andreikalon. Well, I'll describe what this andreikalon is that they're mixing. And from that, they should establish what Homer called the godlike quality that is imbued within humans. Now, okay, what's going on there? That was a very literal translation. I'll get into the weeds here. So, first of all, the godlike word is those last two words there, those adjectives, theoeides and theoeikalon, right? So theoeides means having the eidos, the form of the divine, and notice eidos, the ideas, the forms, very intense Platonic word, not to be taken lightly, right? And theoeikalon, the eik part there is related, remember, to the verb eikasdor, to depict, and eikos, mythos, and eikon, right, image, icon, likeness, right? So the God-like quality in man, as Homer said. So he's referring to the fact that Homer at various points, like in the Odyssey, in Iliad, refers to characters like Telemachus or Agamemnon as being God-like, theoekalos, right? But he takes that Homeric term and does something rather different with it. Now, andreikalon, literally, right, again, we've got that akalon component there. So like it means like the likeness of an andra, right, a man. But typically what it refers to is a pigment that's like skin color, right? So when obviously in the classical period, right, statues were painted. We see them today like these, we see these white marbles and we think that they were like that, but no, they were animated with color. And so the mixing of this man-like hue, this man-image pigment, again, remember what I said earlier about the demiurge being this mixer of pigments, an image which ultimately is found in the pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles, who depicts his divine created divinity, the demiurge, as a mixer of paint pigments, which is fascinating as well. But so what is going on in this passage is at this point in the text, I should explain, Socrates is defining what his ideal political constitution should look like. So remember, he describes his philosopher kings founding the ideal city as zographoi, right, as painters. And then he has them mixing this human-like image pigment. And as they're mixing that pigment, right? They're looking to that which is always good, that which is always modest, that which is always just, i.e., he doesn't say so expressly, but it's very clearly the forms, right? It's pretty express, really. He's saying the forms, right? I.e., in Timaean terms, the paradigm, the noetic paradigm, right? And remember where Timaeus describes the demiurge as looking to the paradigm, looking to the noetic paradigm, as he, as a stographos, as a craftsman, as an artist, is going to create the world, right? Well, in the same way, right, we have the philosopher kings looking to that very same paradigm. In the same way, they're acting in the same manner as God himself and imitating God, and they're mixing this pigment. Now, I want to point out that the word andrakelon, it need not only mean like divine, like pigment, but it can also be like a 3D image. It can refer to a painting or a sculpture as well. In fact, there is a passage, I forget the author now, whether it's Plutarch or Diodorus Siculus, I just can't for the life of me remember, unfortunately, but there's this reference in a text to an architect coming up to Alexander the Great and saying, I'm willing to craft the Mount Athos in its entirety into a statue of you, O Alexander, great king, into an andrakelon, an image of your likeness. And so, how fascinating, right? I actually think that that could very well be a reference to the Plato's Republic and the Timaeus, because when you think about it, right, if these texts were universally understood through this agalmatic reading that I've been emphasizing, right, this idea of statue building, and this architect is claiming, I will build like an Alexandropolis, right, like an Alexandria dedicated to you, and I will carve this mountain that was itself, right, hurled by divine beings in the Titanomachy, right? I will craft that into like a literal huge statue of you, and it will be peopled by citizens. So such that the literal ideal city will be a cult statue of Alexander the Great, right? It seems like he's drawing on this notion of the divine laid out in the form of a man as a city, which ultimately I would suggest comes from Plato. If only I remembered the passage. At any rate, you can find it. You can look it up. But so back to this. This is really remarkable that Plato Socrates is conceiving of the ideal polity, its constitution, being concocted as like pigment by painter, philosopher kings, dialecticians who are looking to the forms, to the paradigm, this celestial paradigm. They use astronomy and dialectic and maths and ratio to get at the forms beyond the heavens, but also use the heavens too, and use number and proportion, ratio and logos to create and mold a city and its citizens into the imago Dei, right, into a likeness of God. Now, what is Plato thinking, and his Socrates, what are they thinking when they're talking about this theoekalon, andrekalon, right, this image of man made in the image of God, right? What are they conceiving of? I think it's very possible that they have in mind the image, the famous image of the shield of Achilles, taken from the 18th Rhapsody or book of the Iliad, right? Where famously the description begins with constellations of heaven circling, and then it has humans dancing, agrarian activities, hunting, plowing, and so on, all this human political activity, judgments being conducted, court proceedings, warfare, sieges of city like Troy itself, all of that happens in this grand cosmic dance of human activity on earth, political life, right? The stoa in motion, if you will, all occurring under the starry constellations. Now, I want to point out that when Socrates at the beginning of the Timaeus in Stephanus, page 19b to C, when he says, I want to see my polity as stoa in motion, right? Painted images of animals in motion. It's an underappreciated element of Hephaestus's miraculous shield in the Iliad, but I actually think it's possible. It doesn't expressly say it per se, but I think certainly in the exegetical tradition by Plato's time era, already the shield of Hephaestus was being conceived as a kind of robotic device in the sense that it was an automaton, that it didn't just have scenes that were lifelike and beautifully done as images, but they were kind of like robotic and they were truly alive. They were in motion. There's this concept in the ancient world, the best artist, if he's truly good, he doesn't just produce lifeless images, but they're imbued, they're alive. And of course, Hephaestus is expressly said in the Iliad to be attended by helpers who are essentially robots that he has crafted out of metal. And that feeds into the whole myth of metals and this idea of the philosopher kings. When they say that in the noble lie, in the myth of metals, God himself crafts the races of metal men, right? The classes, the golden philosopher kings, the silver military class of the guardians, the Phylaces, and the bronze and iron craftsmen and farmers. When the philosopher kings create that myth and say that God is the one molding the citizens, but it's actually them through their mythopoeia crafting them, they're essentially like acting as God, and they're essentially just like a divinity. They're creating like robotic metal statues that are alive and in motion. Okay. And again, in this Hephaestus shield, you have the image of the starry stars, the starry sky in motion, and humans implicitly imitating that motion, because as we're going to see in the ideal polity and in Timaeus's teleology, there's this huge emphasis on, for a city to be ideal and successful, it needs to be to its best ability, guided by philosopher kings in order to correspond and to follow and to imitate the rotational cognition, the fora phronesis of heaven, right, of the divine macrocosm as structured by Nous the demiurge in imitation of the paradigm, right? So to flesh that out a bit more, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty mathematics and geometry of this portion of the Republic, namely Book 8, but I rather will direct you to the learned commentary of James Adam, who has an appendix to his commentary on the Republic that is amazing. And I've just pulled up page 286 from there, just as an example of the depth of how he goes through all the geometry and the maths of this schema, which I don't have time to go through here. It would be a bit onerous in this format, but I'll give just a brief talk about what's the general premise here of Book 8. So in Book 8, Plato Socrates provides these two mathematico-geometric schemata, namely the anthropeos arithmos and the teleos arithmos of the theon geneton. Now, what does that mean? So he speaks of the human number and the perfect number of the begotten divinity. Now, the begotten divinity is obviously the generated divine macrocosm, right? The universe as a living animal created as a likeness or image, a corn of the paradigm, right? Okay, so there's a number that is associated with the divine, the generated divine universe, and there's a number associated with man, and they correspond and interrelate. And the context of these numbers is Socrates' explanation of how breeding needs to be micromanaged in the ideal state. So he says that this numerical and geometric and astronomical schema, because ultimately in the Platonic conception, right, maths and geometry are inherently astronomical in so much as man learns number, first conceived of number as per the Epinomis, through observation of celestial movement, right? Time and number were taught, and ratio, logos, and thus rational thought itself was taught by heaven. Of course, our rotational cognition, right, the fora of our phronesis, is a result of our likeness to heaven intrinsically by design, but also our learning to imitate heaven, right? But the whole point here is that Socrates expressly says in Stephanus page 459e of the Republic that festivals should be set up through law, through nomos, in such a way that brides and bridegrooms are brought together, and special rites, sacrificial rites and hymns, poetic hymns, mythic hymns are performed by the poets of our our ideal city in such a way that like fitting healthy marriages arise. And he says that it would be a great evil, a sin against God and man, if children within the ideal polity were produced right, without the requisite rites and sacrifices and prayers, and without like the attention being prayed without priests and priestesses like praying for the correct marriages. But what he goes on to explain is that these holy marriages, these hieroi gamoi, that should not occur, because mixing sexuality, coitus, should not occur atactos, right, without order, but rather needs to be like mathematically guided, because the priesthood is not only in charge of divine revelation, right, and like irrational possession and mantic promulgation and visionary experiences, right? But as we established before with the liver, after awakening from the frenzy or the dream, right, logos, reason, has to be used. So the priests are the philosopher kings. The priests and poets have to be the philosopher kings. So they're not just people who get divinely possessed and dream dreams, but they also, behind all of that icastic image production of myth, they also are skilled philosophers, dialecticians, mathematicians, geometers, and astronomers. And so they can synthesize all of this myth and divine revelation and wild inspiration with pure rationality as well into one cohesive worldview. And they use that to come up with an actual numerical schema, a number, right? A set of numbers correlating with each other, one pertaining to the macrocosm and one to microcosmic man, in such a way that they can work out the perfect cycle of breeding in order to bring about the best citizens. So it's a kind of mathematical eugenics based on imitation of the paradigm of heaven, the number of circulating time in the heavens. And this numerical schema is described as the kurios amenon kai kaironon genesion, right? The lord over the best and the worst births, right? So in order to bring about good or bad births, you have to understand all this niche astronomical mathematical knowledge, and you have to use it to guide the citizenry. And what's interesting about how Adam explains this mathematical schema is it works out in such a way that there is like a lifespan of a man is a century in essence, as is mentioned expressly in the myth of Ur in Book 10 of the Republic. And it correlates when you times a century lifespan of one microcosmic human by a whole year, 360, you get like a year, you get an equivalent portion of time for the lifespan of the divine macrocosm, right? The generated universe. So that, what the implication in that is like that there's a period of gestation and growth of mankind as a dawn, right? As an organism, an animal. Likewise, the macrocosm is also like an organism with like a lifespan, albeit over on a much grander scale of time. But still has like an embryonic phase of development, a maturity, and implicitly, even though it's not necessarily said, also a demise. I think Adam is quite right in his analysis when he claims that the Timaean cosmology should be correlated with Book 8's conception of the numerical geometric schema of monitoring breeding, because all of it is given in this broader context, right? Of there's this repeated theme in the Republic of, even though the philosopher kings are going to do their best to establish a city that perpetuates itself eternally, it is prophesied, there's an oracle, that it is inevitable that at one point things will get out of kilter, and bronze and iron men will rise to the rank of silver and gold, right? So unworthy, unphilosophic individuals will take over government and cause a breakdown and an inevitable corruption. And even despite the efforts of the philosopher kings, at some point the ideal polity is going to disintegrate and crumble and go and fall apart, and then it's going to have to be restructured again, and the slate's going to be wiped clean. So there's this eternal cycle of restructuring, of structuring, perpetuating success for a long time, then crumbling, and then the same thing. And that's the same pattern that occurs in the Timaean cosmogony, as I understand it. I think it begins with disordered matter, gets ordered by the demiurge, but then implicitly, the generated divine macrocosm has a lifespan, it has a life cycle, and at some point there is this inevitable falling apart of the heavens, right? The heavens become out of whack, like in the myth told by the Egyptian priest of Phaethon. There's a parallaxis, a change in the moving of the celestial bodies that brings about a cataclysm or a conflagration, right? In the same way, I think that in the same way that the divine universe has cycles that inevitably decay and has a lifespan as an organism, so too the city and individual humans have corresponding lifespans. And Plato Socrates believes that there is a mathematical schema behind all of this that can be worked out through maths and dialectic and observation of the heavens. And so Adam, in his commentary and all this, correlates all of that with the famous myth of the statesman or the politicus, right? Now, I'm not going to do too deep of a dive into that because it's more ancillary, but what's going on there is it famously tells the tale of, Thyestes, the Thyestean feast, right? The cannibalism of eating his own children, and that vile cannibalistic sin results in the sun changing direction. And so, like, the progression through the ecliptic changes direction. And that brings about a change in order. So prior to that, it was the golden age of Kronos, in which there was like a Benjamin Button situation whereby people reversed in the sense that they were fully developed, like wise grown people, and gradually reduced into like infants and like shrunk into the earth, and they were born out of the earth, and things lived for a very long time, and humans had like perfect communion with all animals. It was like an Eden situation. But when Thyestes perpetrated this vile deed, the sun changed its path, so the celestial rotation changed, and sin arose. So Socrates tells that as like a traditional myth, and then he explains that he gives his own tale like that's similar to that, whereby he describes God as the head of a ship who like goes atop like the mast and observes the world in a state of disarray, and like summons all the gods to take a look at things. That I actually erred there slightly. That's how Critias's the work called the Critias ends. It actually ends with the gods being gathered at a viewpoint by Zeus to look at the corrupt world to arrange for a cataclysm, right, in order to wipe out humanity and to start again. But I think that, again, is the same thing, because in the statesman, in the politicus, we have this idea of God intervenes when he sees the world crumbling in cataclysms, because he actually withdraws from managing its healthy rotational cognition. He withdraws from that and lets it spiral into decay and lets it be destroyed and lets conflagrations occur and kill off evil people and animals, and then like twists it back the right way and rectifies it in order to create like a healing situation. So that whole dynamic, and he explains it, that's of course inherited from Empedoclean cosmology, right, where you have Sphiros, the perfect spherical divine universe, that when strife, Nakos, dominates, you get like falling apart, whereas when love, philia, dominates, you get like cohesion. That same sort of thing of these endless, and in fact, it's too long of a story to get into here, but through scholia, commentaries on Aristotelian texts, we can actually reconstruct Empedocles' cosmology as involving the tetractys, right? The same Pythagorean ratio formula that informs Timaeus's account of the world's soul structure, the soul that governs the rotational cognition of heaven, of the universe. That same formula is used by Empedocles to describe like the life phases of the divine macrocosm, right? The age wherein like love predominates and cohesion occurs, the age of like destruction and strife, and it's always cyclical. These ideas are all informing, I think, Plato's conception of the ideal polity. And I think in this context, we have to make brief mention of the so-called great year. So in the Timaeus at Stephanus page 39d, there's brief mention of like the fulfillment of a period of time when the rotations of the 8 rotations, that is the 7 classical planets, their rotatory bands along the band of the different, and also the band of the same, right? That is the sphere of the Sphinx stars, which is the 8th rotation after the 7 classical planets. He says there's a point at which all of these come to a head, right? Scare kephalen. He doesn't specify exactly what that means. He just explains that these 8 rotations that make up the perfect year and the number of time, they come to a head at a certain point. All these rotating bands align. The significance of that is it's all given in the context of time being like the perfect likeness of the complete and perfect noetic animal, namely the paradigm. And so all of this infrastructure is like a mimesis, an imitation of the eternal nature of the forms. But what's important for present purposes, right, is how do we interpret this 8 circling entities coming to a point, to a head, literally? Well, we know from like later tradition and commentaries and so on that this most likely refers to a kind of equinoctial alignment of all the planets with the fixed star constellation of Aries during the equinox. And how do we know that? Well, I've extracted some texts here that are relevant. It's worth also just briefly noting that when at Stephanus page 69a, Timaeus describes the end point of the midsection of his second recapitulation of the story, his second narrative cycle, he ends up by saying, I'm going to place a kephale, a head, atop my mythos, which is kind of an image that's like a statue-based image, right? Because you would construct an Agalma statue and it would be headless and you would stick one on. In fact, if you go back in my videos to that cup, the forge cup that showed a statue workshop, there actually was a depiction, if you recall, of a headless statue. So implicitly, by saying I'm going to put a head on this mythos, he's kind of implicitly calling his logos itself in its totality a statue that he's arming with a head. And then in his account of astronomy, of this perfect alignment at this particular point, he again refers to it coming to a head. And now we know from, for instance, John Liddus, a later Byzantine writer on calendrics and myth, he mentions that the new month, the Neomenea, is called the head of the month, the Kephalemenos, by the ancients, presumably Pythagoreans. And then he also mentions the Babylonians and Egyptians as conceiving the arche, the start, the beginning of the year, as the spring equinox, which they call as being the equinox when it falls in the constellation of the ram, right, i.e. Aries, and they associate that with the head. Likewise, Philo refers to the caput zodiaci vocant arietem, right? The head of the zodiac, the head of the zodiac is called Aries, right? The ram constellation. Likewise, we get in the doxographic compilation ascribed to Aedes, we get mention of the Megas Eniautos, the great year, and the so-called head of the year, Chronos, right, being a manuscript correction for the defective Chronos with a K, though it's not necessarily defective because in later traditions they were, identified through allegoresis, but that text, Aedes's doxography, explains it in terms of the 7 planets in the same day coming to the same starting point in their rotation. So it's what I was describing earlier. I think there's good reason to believe that these ancient commentarial traditions, albeit much later than Plato himself, are correct in their understanding of how the great year number is to be conceived. Now, it's also worth pointing out that John Liddus, in his De Mensibus, says that on account of this, the head of time, kephalen to chrono, is what the Pythagoreans called this first day, right? So there's this conception of the first day as involving all of the planets and being aligned at this point in the fixed stars, namely Aries, which is conceived of as the head of the year. And so too, Basil in his homily on Genesis, the hexaemeron, he says the same thing about the head of the year being the first day, and he's saying it in reference to the ancient Greek translation of Genesis 1:5, where we have, and it became evening, and it became morning, day one. It's not the first day, but rather it's hemeramia, right? It's day one, and so there's this cosmogonic conception of the first day as this astronomical event of perfect alignment in Aries. But there's the point of all this, how this relates to all that talk before about micromanaging the breeding of citizens and sustaining the constitution through imitation of heaven and so on, is I think implicit in all this is there's an idea that the birthing, the first day is like cyclical, right? And that after this extended period of time, you get this alignment that must happen at the cusp of some grand decay and some grand rebirth, right? So in a sense, the Timaean cosmogony is to be conceived of as occurring at the point of this divine alignment, in that it's the point when God intervenes in this deranged, melted world to restructure it and make it start all over again. And then from that joint starting point of Aries, all these celestial bodies start moving out. It's not until this grand span of time, the number of which was hotly debated in antiquity, we don't need to know, but this grand span of time wherein they realign. Proclus has got some comments there that you can look at later, but they're pretty specific. But notice that idea of the myth of the statesman, of these cycles of changing direction and dissolution and reintegration by God, who's managing the rotation of heaven. That fits in very well with all that I've been outlining here. It shows that there is one consistent cosmology. Now, something of interest here is a medieval manuscript I've produced of the so-called zodiac man. So you can see a human being with these zodiacal constellations, planted there. Now, you can't see the horn, sadly, because the manuscript's cut off, but that is Aries on the head. So the head of the year and the head of man correlate there. Now, some might contest that, that's medieval. What does that to do with antiquity? Well, I haven't produced all the sources here because it's a bit onerous, but there are a lot of late antique writers, most famously Manilius in his Astronomicon, who actually do talk extensively about zodiac constellations correlating with parts of the body, but also regions of Earth. And that's the same kind of thinking that I think informs the Platonic conception of the ideal polity. And I mentioned before the diagraphe of the dodecahedral firmament being identifiable with the diagraphe, the constitutional sketch of this the zographoi philosopher kings, right? The painters, animal painters, who are the philosopher kings, creating their own diagrammatic celestial geometric schema of the ideal constitution. That is also, if we recall, right, also a theoekalon and drakalon, right, a godlike statue or image of man. So all of this in this really complicated way is interconnected, right? Astronomy, politics, art, myth telling, anatomy, gymnastics, myth, music. It's all coming together in this one schema, this one conception. It's a religion, it's an all encompassing religion of political constitution, how the state is to be structured, how people are to behave, what their myths are to be, what their rituals are to be, what their education system is to be. And it's all integrated into the Timaean account of creation by God. And the ultimate thrust of it all is that man is to reach his full potential by imitating the heavenly paradigm and acting like God as a demiurge himself. And if he's not a philosopher who can do that, he can at least be a citizen of such a city wherein he, as an Agalma man, or as a statue man, can be molded by those philosopher kings into a theoekalon and drikalon, right? Into a likeness of God. Okay. Now, this is a bit random, but I think it's very interesting and helpful. So I've made mention in passing about how the starry dodecahedron, that diagraphe, right, the foundational institution of time, chronos, as the visible image of the eternal paradigm. The patterns of stars, these constellations, I argue, are like blueprints for the creation of terrestrial animals by the sub-demiurges, who are the planetary and astral gods. So I just wanted to extract this passage from a rather bizarre source, perhaps for some people, namely the Refutation of All Heresies, a document ascribed to St. Hippolytus of Rome, an early pope and heresiologist. And so he's describing the beliefs of a Gnostic sect here who, they understand the soteriology of the gospel through constellations. And they have a belief, it will be shown, that the constellations were designed by God as blueprints for the animals of earth. And the reason, as eternal blueprints for the animals on earth, the reason I think this is significant is, okay, so there was a Gnostic sect who thought this in late antiquity. Where did they get their idea? Or not even late antiquity, actually. Hippolytus of Rome, if we're happy to accept that ascription, is quite early. Depends where what you conceive late antiquity as. In the early AD period, let's say, right, these ideas were floating around. So he says, Cepheus, right, the humanoid constellation from the mythic cycle of Andromeda and Perseus, right? So Cepheus is close to Cassiopeia and Andromeda and Perseus, right, as part of the famous mythic cycle, right, of this vain queen who boasted against that her daughter was more beautiful than the nymphs of the sea. And so Poseidon punished her by sending the sea creature, the Cetus, right, Ketos, to consume her daughter Andromeda, who's bound up as a sacrifice to this sea monster, right, which is a common theme that occurs in the founding mythology of Troy as well, with maidens being offered to the same sea creature. But at any rate, Perseus intervenes with his, flying with Pegasus and saves the maiden Andromeda. And then the constellations depict this story as an image, an icon, right? But Hippolytus, in describing this sect and referring to that constellational cluster, he says that this sect conceived of these constellations as large grammata, that is letters or texts of creation, that those who were capable could see them and truly perceive them and read them. And they said that Cepheus in this constellation, who's the king of Ethiopia where this is occurring, is to be conceived of as Adam. Cassiopeia is conceived of as Eve, and Andromeda is the soul of both of them, okay, of both Adam and Eve. And Perseus is to be conceived as the Logos, Christ, the winged child of Zeus, i.e., of God the Father, who sweeps in. And Ketos is to be conceived of as the devil, right, the serpent that plots against Adam and Eve. So Christ the Logos intervenes, swoops, snatches up the soul maiden and frees her from the attack on Adam and Eve by the serpent. That's their Gnostic interpretation, okay? Uh, so the one who slayed the beast, right, the devil, serpent, Christ the Logos, or Perseus via the Cetus, the Ketos, right? He comes in. Comes for none other than Andromeda, right? Than the soul of Adam and Eve, to take her, Andromeda, the soul of Adam and Eve, to himself. She who had been given over to the beast, right, to the creature. So Perseus, the Logos, defends the soul from that creature, from the devil, the snake beast, okay, the serpent. And so Perseus is like the winged axon, right, rotational point, who joins the poles through the middle of the earth and who rotates the whole cosmos. So again, right, Perseus as Jesus Christ, the Logos, is like identified with the figure, let's say, of the Platonic Godhead who maintains the rotation of the universe in the myth of the statesman, right? The directional cognition for phronesis of the universe. And so then Hippolytus says about this Gnostic sect that the spirit, i.e. the Holy Spirit, right, is the bird, the Kuknos, right, the swan constellation in the cosmos that is next to the bears. And this is a musical animal, the swan, because of the swan song, right? And it is thus a symbol of the divine spirit, of the Holy Spirit, okay, Spirit of God. Because when swans come to the end of their life, they, it is in their nature to sing. And so too, with the good hope, when the swan goes to leave from this creation, this world, it sends up noble like hymns to God, right? So because the swan song happens just before it dies, right? So it's the swan's an appropriate constellation to symbolize the Paraclete because when it's about to die and leave this unfrozen world of sin, it sings to God in praise, right? And is ready to make the great journey to the truer life, right? From this false life, so to speak. Interestingly, the Paraclete in the book of Acts famously, right? Pentecost descends, and in the baptism of Christ, I should say more properly, in the Gospels, descends in the form of a dove expressly. In the baptism of Christ, not the Paraclete at Pentecost where it's tongues of fire, my apologies, but that dove descending on the waters in that context, this is getting into Christian cosmology, but it is helpful to look at this as a I'll get into why it's helpful, but the notion of the dove descending on the waters at the baptism of Christ is highly significant because it goes back to Genesis where the Spirit is said to hover on the waters like a bird hovering. The Spirit of God, right, the Ruach of Elohim, the Spirit of God hovers on the waters like a bird. So the implication there is that baptism is kind of like a recreation, a recapitulation of creation in the form of Christ as the cosmic man. Okay, but this bolded end portion of Hippolytus is where we get Timaean content, right? So these crabs and these bulls and these lions and these rams, these goats, all these constellations, these beasts, these creatures laid out in stars that are all named such across the surface of heaven. They are all icons and are paradigms, eikones and paradigmata, right? And it is from them that this ever-changing creation, this ever-changing, right, implicitly sublunar creation, receives its forms, its ideas from those animals, right? So Hippolytus says expressly that this Gnostic sect consider the ever-changing world of becoming, of gignomena, and the animals that we see ever decaying and ever generating here on Earth in the sublunar world as being based on, derived from, as being images, acornis, of paradigmata that are those constellations that you see there on the screen. Whilst Timaeus never says, he does speak of these creatures on Earth being like acornis icons of the noetic animals. He does say that. He doesn't mention the constellational patterns being intermediaries, sketches. He doesn't expressly say it, but he does have that bit about God painting the surface of the firmament that's a dodecahedron as a zographos, right? Dias zographon. And I think implicitly the idea is that these constellational arrangements are blueprints, and that this Gnostic sect is preserving the correct understanding to an extent of Timaean cosmogony, which is not at all surprising, because it should be noted that the famous Gnostic library of Nag Hammadi in Egypt, at the find wherein we got like the hypostasis of the archons and all these fascinating Gnostic texts in Coptic, included there in that collection of texts was an extensive translation of the Republic of Plato in, I believe, in Coptic, not Greek, in Coptic translation, alongside these Gnostic texts. So that makes sense. These Gnostics were big on Plato, so they can be used, I think, hermeneutically to kind of reconstruct some of the subtle subtext of Plato. Many would call me mad and find that boring and think I'm an idiot, and they can think that, and maybe I am an idiot, but I thought it was cool at the very least, and I think it's shed some light on the matter. So another point I wanted to raise as we near the end now. So the very final portion of the text of the Timaeus, as it's come down to us, Stephanus page 92c, it ends in a paragraph that I consider I think it's quite hymnic. It's quite like a hymn. So I'll do a translation. So it says, our logos, our discourse that we have now spoken is reaching, our discourse about the all, the pan, right, the universe, now has already reached its telos, its goal, its end. And it includes both the mortal and immortal animals, Doa, all of which are wrapped up and included within this complete cosmos, which is itself a visible animal which contains all visible animals and is an icon, a corn of the noetic, and is itself a perceivable God, a sense-perceived God, the visible universe, who is most grand, most great, most excellent, most beautiful, most perfect, this one heaven, this unique one, this only begotten one. And again, that same monogenes, only begotten, is used of Christ the Logos in the Nicene Creed, which is of interest. But at any rate, this idea that there's one visible universe, which is all a unified animal that's perfect, and that's an eikon to noetou. Now, it's a bit weird because noetou, that an icon, an image or likeness of the noetic. Noetic is used grammatically as a substantive, so the noetic what, right? Does that mean an icon? This cosmos is a noetic, is an icon, a likeness or depiction of the noetic cosmos? Perhaps, but it doesn't say expressly cosmos. Some people don't like that. They say, no, that's a later Platonic thing. There's no noetic cosmos in Plato. I think there can be, but okay. But then of what? Of the noetic paradigm, of the noetic Godhead. Because I identified the paradigm and the Godhead and the demiurge nous together, it's not an issue for me to use that substantive. And I also would say that you can call all of that the noetic cosmos, right? The paradigm, nous, the demiurge, all of that is the noetic cosmos, of which this visible cosmos is an image. But at any rate, that is how the text ends, with that nice synopsis. But I just produced this diagram here because I've mentioned in passing the account of reincarnation that Timaeus gives, which is just prior to this closing hymn in the kind of final portion of the text. So we mentioned long ago, I think in one of the earlier talks, about how the just humans, their souls were initially implanted in celestial bodies, then were sown into the human body. Now, then if they live justly as terrestrial humans, their souls go back to the luminaries, right? Now, Timaeus says that those who do a lot of astronomy and high-level thinking, but are still a bit dopey, so to speak, they come back, they are reincarnated as birds, which are creatures made primarily of air, that are lofty, that fly high, close to heaven, but nonetheless, are unworthy due to their failings. Then the people who are dominated by like anger and zeal of the thymos, they become hearty terrestrial creatures. And those who are base and solely driven by gluttony and sexual avarice, they become sea creatures, right? Because their epithymeticon dominated them. But when you lay out these elements and these life forms onto the human body, like I do in this diagram, because when you think about it, it's the misuse of a part of your body that leads to incarnation as a kind of creature associated with an element. Or in the case of the nous, it can be the correct use. So correct use of your celestial starry nous leads you back up to fire and ether, the stars of heaven, right? Having an airy nous, being an airhead, makes you an airy bird. Being an earthen thymos of the chest person, makes you an earthen animal. Being a watery, desirous person makes you a watery creature. But that mapping of life forms, elements, and creatures onto the human body, right here in my diagram, expressing what Timaeus expresses there, notice how it kind of expresses the same idea as this medieval zodiac man. So perhaps there's a connection there. Interestingly, too, we have this passage from Empedocles, wherein he depicts two painters offering up like a painting as an offering to the divine. And he describes them grabbing the multicolored pharmaca pigments in their hands and mixing them together in a harmony, and then creating various forms, ideas, right, that resemble like trees and all the various things that have been constructed by God, the demiurge, men, women, beasts, birds, fish that are fed in the sea, by water, and the long-living gods who are given great honors, and so on. So that's just an interesting comparandum in so much as I think when you visualize everything that the Timaean cosmogony presents and you pay attention to the fact that Diaz do Graphron, right, in his structuring of the dodecahedral firmament, God is like a painter, and you remember all the stuff about him being an image maker, and the philosopher kings being painters and statue makers and so on. When you combine all this stuff together, you get a really compelling artistic image of the Platonic cosmogony. Now, what I want to close on is a last final thought. Okay, given everything that I've said, much of which is quite scandalous, perhaps, to those who are very conservative in their treatment of sources and their distinction of time periods, who would accuse me of misreading the Timaeus by interjecting later conceptions. But I think I did a pretty good job of showing you that what I'm saying comes from the text. Just because, yeah, I'm sure I'm informed by later texts, but I don't really see why I need to apologize for that. I think these later texts are natural outgrowths and continuations of Platonism, so it's natural that they would be helpful for interpreting and reconstructing Platonism. Now, given everything that I've said about time as the moving image of eternity and the ecliptic, the zodiac belt as the band of the different along with the band of the same, which forms the cognition of heaven, and man as the constitution of the ideal polity is the theoekalon, andrekalon, right, the godlike man image, and so on, and the way the ideal polity is governed by philosopher kings through heavenly number to breed the perfect statuary men who are images of the divine. Given all that I've said, now looking at this late antique mosaic of Chronos, of the divinity time, as a perfect, robust man situated there within the zodiac belt in front of the Lady Gaia, Lady Earth, And then on the right, the depiction of Protagonist Phanes, the Orphic creator divinity emerging from the ether egg, wrapped in the serpent time, the serpent zodiac with like many heads. You can see there on his torso, he has a ram, a lion head, and a goat head. Right, the ram being Aries and the lion being Leo. These zodiac constellations are like embedded in his chest, right, sticking out of his thymos, almost in the same manner that in Book 9 of the Republic, the tyrannical man is described as a humanoid with like a lion image within his exterior humanoid statue, right? You see that, and you see along the exterior this egg-shaped zodiac belt. Okay, so in all of this, the question arises, I haven't really spoken about, so we have all this rich cosmology of presented in the Timaeus. Timaeus tells this story of creation, of a creator God who looks to a paradigm to make the world as a living creature. Where does that come from, right? Are we to believe that this is a unique idiosyncratic conception of Plato alone without any cultural influence? I don't think so. I actually think that Plato is reworking Orphic material and is inheriting the conception of much of his cosmology from an Orphico-Pythagorean context. And I actually think that the Orphic deity Kronos and the Orphic deity Protagonist Phanes and the ex ovo cosmogony, right, the cosmogony of an egg as the start of the all, I think all of this has, even though much of our sources are Hellenistic and are from late antiquity, in fact, most of our Orphic fragments, the greatest number of our fragments of Orphic cosmogonic poetry, come from Proclus, specifically his commentary on the Timaeus, as well as to some extent his commentary on the Cratylus, but mainly his commentary on the Timaeus. Now, I don't think that's coincidental, even though the Orphic rhapsodies are in some sense a Hellenistic and late antique cultural product. We know from the Daveni Papyrus, I would submit, that much of these myths, even though they really become robust in the Hellenistic period and later, they already were around the classical period. It's just that our record of them is fragmentary. But if we can show that Protagonist Phanes is present as a demiurge figure already within the Daveni Papyrus, then there's reason to think that already such a worldview was around and that it inspired Plato. That's quite a bold statement, and that requires a very deep dive, and that is why my next video presentation will be on Orphism, and specifically the creator deity Protagonist Phanes, and it will be a deep dive in trying to look at the source material and really develop a deep understanding of who the deity is, how we know who he was, and what our sources are and how those sources interrelate with each other. So that's a huge topic, but that's something to look forward to for the next talk. So until then, farewell.